Hello, Johnny Fluffypunk here, and today with Gloucestershire Archives we're going to be looking at poverty and punishment. Now these days there's not many of us would call ourselves wealthy or rich. I know I don't, and I bet a lot of you don't either. Houses cost a fortune to rent or buy, food prices keep going up, and it seems that the money coming into the house keeps going down. But if you get really ill, there's still a wonderful health service that's free to use. And look, I bet this pound that none of you watching this have ever had to spend time in a damp jail cell with only rats for company, no window, and a great big rusty chain around your ankle. But in Victorian Gloucester, I'd lose my pound. Gloucestershire Archives is a treasure trove of documents and photographs, and it's like opening a window and looking through into corners of the past that you never knew existed, layers of history that underpin these very streets on which we live and walk and go to school. And from the archives, you learn how life for an ordinary person, just like you or me in Gloucestershire, in the towns or cities or out in the countryside, could be very difficult indeed, especially if you fell on hard times, if you lost your home or lost your job or couldn't find one in the first place, and woe betide if you got really ill and couldn't support your family. Or if you did anything naughty, even very little naughty things. Now, before 1834, poor people were looked after to varying degrees by the parish in which they lived. They could buy food and clothing using poor money, which was a kind of tax taken off of landowners and other wealthy people in the parish. And then, in 1834, the government passed something called the Poor Law Amendment Act. And this ensured that poor people could receive no support at all unless they went to live in these huge, great, dark, prison-like buildings, brand new, called workhouses. And the idea was, in the workhouses, the poor were helped to help themselves. And in reality, this meant they had to work really hard if they were going to get any kind of accommodation or food. And the conditions in the workhouses were deliberately horrible to put off what the government called idlers, lazy people. Families were split up. It was a terrible place to live, and people lived in fear of ending up in the workhouse. Living in desperate times often meant people were forced to do desperate acts, stealing money and food, more often than not, just because they were poor and starving, not because they were bad people. And every town had its house of correction, and bigger places had jails, and punishments could be really severe. You could be sentenced to hard labour, or being hit with the birch, or thrown in a prison cell, or even sent abroad, transported to faraway lands, all as punishments. And it made no difference if you were a child either. So let's take a closer look at some of this horrible history right on our doorstep. Now, this great big building behind me is all nice flats now, and it looks all right. But this was built as Stroud's workhouse, and this is where you might end up if things got really bad. And this was built to house 500 people. And men, women and children all had to live in separate areas of the workhouse and work in separate areas. And this meant that families got split up. And you know what? You'd even get into trouble if you tried to talk to each other. And the workhouse claims to offer a rudimentary education to children, but this didn't even include reading or writing, which were the things you needed if you wanted to get a job and get out. And people living in the workhouse all had to wear a uniform, and this meant that everybody looked the same. And it also meant that when you went out into the outside world, people knew you lived in the workhouse. And in those days, that was a thing of shame. And in the archive, there's whole lists of people who ended up living in workhouses like this all across Gloucestershire, how long they stayed, what they looked like, descriptions of their behaviour, medical records, and often, in many cases sadly, death records. A lot of people died in the workhouse, and often these records are the only evidence that any of these people ever walked on the earth. So this car park by Gloucester Station is where Gloucester's workhouse used to be, and it's long gone now, thankfully. But in the archives you can find photographs and plans of workhouses across the county, and you can see how people were kept separate, how families were kept apart, and how people were made to exercise in little yards overseen by supervisors from little tiny special windows. And the young and the old, as well as men and women, were made to work really hard, often doing really unpleasant jobs from 6 in the morning till 6 in the evening. And if you objected, well, you got punished. I mean, it was horrible. No wonder everyone did everything they could to keep out of the workhouse. And for some, this meant turning to crime. And if you got caught, well, chances are you'd end up in here or somewhere very like it. This is Gloucester Jail. It's closed now, but for over 200 years this housed all sorts of people, sometimes in very unsanitary conditions. And 123 people were executed here too, and some of them are still buried underneath. But most of the people imprisoned in here, they weren't murderers or horribly violent people. They were just petty criminals, thieves and the like, often driven to crime by poverty. They certainly weren't evil. And in the archives there's all kinds of prison and court records, and it's fascinating ploughing through them and finding some of the stories of these people. People like poor old Edgar Kilminster, or I should say poor young Edgar Kilminster, aged 7, imprisoned in here for a week with the birch and hard labour, all for stealing some sweets. Or Sarah Parsons, aged 14, she got a month for stealing a bowl of soup. There's lists of people set free and those convicted, some given fines, some given hard labour, some given the birch, some given prison sentences, and some even sent abroad on ships to places like Australia for years at a time to do penal servitude. And some of the stories of people you'll find written in pamphlets and little leaflets that were handed out back in the day by people campaigning to set them free. And you'll find stuff in the archives dealing with the kinder sides of life too. Everything from lists of medicines dispensed to poor people to stuff about places like this. These were almshouses, which were houses provided by churches and charities for the poor. So, have a look through all the stuff in the archives. Enjoy it. If you're anything like me, you'll find it really fires the imagination. So, this is a little letter poem addressed to poor Edgar Kilminster in Gloucester Jail. Dear Edgar, I am sorry to hear that you are in prison, and from the future I will send the sweet and sour fizzy taste of a full bag of Haribo, the smell of just fried KFC, the sound of your cell door opening forever, the sight of Gloucester prison being knocked down, and I will send you a big metal plate to shove down your trousers and stop the sting of the birch. This is called If We Ran the Workhouse. If we ran the workhouse, above the door would be written, "Help, not punishment." If we ran the workhouse, everyone could wear what they like, but waiting for everyone in their room would be a brand new t-shirt that said, "Champ in the making." If we ran the workhouse, everyone would wake up to the smell of fresh coffee, and a waiter would appear at the door waving a breakfast menu that gleamed like pure gold. If we ran the workhouse, everyone would have a soft bed and a sofa big enough to stretch out on, and on gold-fringed cushions would be written, "Be who you want to be." If we ran the workhouse, then it would be a holiday from having to worry about money. It would be a place to dream, to gather your thoughts, to plan your next move, to get to feel strong again. If we ran the workhouse, then if people asked why, we'd say, "Because you're worth it." And now it's your turn to do a little bit of writing. See you soon. Bye.